Hello, my lovely friends. I'm Justice for anybody who doesn't know me. I'm a professional healer hypnotherapist, but that's not really relevant for this conversation because I want to talk to you about shame. And if you happen to join this live at any point in time, if you want to pop your name in, if you want to leave a comment, how you're doing, how you're feeling, how this relates to you. I welcome the conversation and the dialogue back and forth because I make these to help build a community and talk about topics hard, holy, and human. And I think one of the hardest things for us to talk about as humans is shame. And one of the reasons that shame is hard to talk about is if it's not brought up skillfully, as soon as we start to talk about a shameful experience, the way that we're neurologically wired for empathy with each other, it's like shame not only comes through our system, even when we're sharing about like an experience that we felt shame around, but because of the sort of the empathological wiring that we have, it will also kind of jump from system to system. And that makes it really hard to talk about. So I want to talk about it because I had a big shame trigger come up today. And I'm going to invite you, before we, dive into this topic, to take a breath and relax and ground. And what is grounding? Grounding is just knowing where you are in space and time in this moment. It's connecting to your body, connecting to your breath, maybe feeling, whatever's going on inside of you at a visceral, physical standpoint. And I'm going to turn my vibrator off here. Oh, my vibrator. Oh, there. Oh, no. There. Okay. Oh, there. Okay. Thanks for being patient with me. What was I saying? Oh, yes. Visceral. Grounding is visceral. It's physical. So in order to ground, I'm gonna bring my attention into my body. I'm gonna feel my feet in my little furry boots. I'm gonna notice my breath. I'm gonna notice that I have a belly full of delicious, very late breakfast. All these are physical sensations. Okay. So, shame. Why is it so fucking stupid hard for us? I mean, I think one of the reasons it's really hard is because aside from it being a biological experience, physiological experience to feeling like we've done something wrong, or to being threatened, or to having to being to being having our vulnerability put out. It's also so frequently weaponized to try to make us be or do better. And we experience this, and with family systems, we experience this with society, and then we try to use it to leverage better behavior from ourselves. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with what does the shame dialogue sound like for you? And I'll invite you guys, if you want to participate in this conversation, I love the comments and I love the back and forth. So I'll ask you this question. What does the shame dialogue inside your head sound like? What does it sound like you shaming you? For me, it's like you're doing it wrong. No matter what it is, you're doing it wrong. And it tends to really crop up for me around important things, especially communication. You're doing it wrong. You communicated imperfectly. You weren't present enough. The things that I really hold value and I hold myself to a high standard at, but that also feel very vulnerable because they're important to me, that tends to be where it goes after me with my inner dialogue. So one of the things that I have to continually come back to reminding myself is there's no such thing as a perfect conversation. There's no perfect way to communicate. It's always going to be a little bit messy. I'm always going to get it. Like, I'm always going to fumble a little bit. It's always going to be a little raw. It's always going to be a little awkward. And sometimes it's going to be, well, not always, but that's another one. That's actually another shaming tactic. Always. And sometimes it's going to come out really elegant and sweet and compassionate and intelligent, but not always, and that's okay. Julie says, you're doing it wrong. It's not good enough. No one will want this, etc. Yes. Yeah. And when you're saying no one will want this, are you talking about like yourself as a physical, emotional identity, like offering yourself? Or are you talking about like your arts or your gifts or whatever? Either way, it's the result is the same. So when you're hearing this from yourself, when you're hearing this, you're doing it wrong. Nobody's going to want this. You're not good enough. That's not good enough, right? What do you feel in your body? What do you notice? This is a really important part of recognizing the shame trigger. Okay. So in order to kind of sort of cultivate a shared experience, I'm going to tell you guys my most recent shame story. And I'm going to invite you just to ground as I share it with you. But first, I'm going to read Julie's other comment. Life is so messy if we don't continually come with curiosity. Key. Yes, I am talking about my gifts, my feelings, my emotions, all voices from my childhood that still seep in. Lori says, yes, Julie, all that is so relevant. And we're definitely talking about a lot of childhood programming when we're talking about shame. And regrettably, because it's not a conversation that we're able to effectively have most of the time, it becomes like transgenerational programming, and it also becomes transgenerational trauma. Lori says, how could you let them treat you that way? Oh, love. Whew. How could you stop them? Yeah, I mean, oh, that hits home for me too. And the question I want to ask you is the same question that I ask myself, is how could you stop them? How can you stop the internal machinations of someone else's value system or what's going through them? And then how can you actually stop someone else's behavior? The most we can do to stop or redirect someone's behavior is we can confront them on it. We can call it out. We can tell them how we feel. We can attempt to hold them accountable, or we can exercise another boundary by walking away. All of those tactics are not typically going to be available to a child. So I would ask you, when you hear that voice inside, that how could you let them treat you that way? How old do you actually feel? And Laurie says, it is what others say to me. How could you let them treat you that way? Yeah, and I think it's curious. I think that's that actually is shaming right there. It's like you're making the assumption that you can change someone else's behavior, or that someone else is making the assumption that you can change someone else's behavior. It's actually very shaming. So, and it's not surprising that it comes up reflectively and projectively, because we internalize these patterns and these language patterns and these emotional patterns when we're children. And then because our nervous system has been wired that way, we re-experience those through other relationships throughout the rest of our life. So I'm going to ask you, Lori, when you hear that, how old does that make you feel? Most of this stuff starts really young before we can actually do something about it, so that when we encounter it when we're older, we still feel like we can't. And on that note, okay, Lori says she feels like she's 12 when she hears that. Yeah, a 12-year-old. I mean, what kind of options do you have? What can you really do about someone else's behavior at that age? You can confront a parent, and a lot of the time they're just, that's not going to have very effective results. We can't walk away. We can't run away. Oh, I tried when I was probably about that age. But it doesn't usually work very well. And there's a whole other set of complications that arise if we do. At 12 years old, you, Lori, me, Justice, I have 12-year-old triggers too. You didn't have a lot of options. So now what arises in your system, Lori says, it makes her defensive and angry. Yes. Anger is a healthy response to being violated. Being defensive is a natural response to wanting to protect ourselves. When that gets internalized because it doesn't have anywhere to go, our nervous system will keep that on repeat. And because anger and defensiveness fight, we want to talk about shame and survival strategies as being the similar, if not the same thing. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. When you go into shame, one of those is likely going to be your go-to response. It sounds like, Lori, you get angry, you want to fight. This is a healthy reaction. There's nothing wrong with that. It needs to be able to process through your system to come to a place of resolution. So we wanna give you, Lori, just validation that that's not an unhealthy response, and to come into your body and breathe with that feeling, breathe with that reaction, let it run its course through you. Jeannie DePrima says, I was sexually abused for years by my husband, rest in peace, and the way he used pornography with me when I was 17 made me feel terribly ashamed. That was 1982. It has taken me years to overcome the effects of that, and I did successfully leave him. I took my children and built a new life for us, but the shame followed me. Oh, sweetie. Okay. This is why it's hard to talk about, because it's now in the room. So I want to take a moment to breathe, to ground myself, to acknowledge your pain, Jeannie, and to invite everybody else who just witnessed this to recognize that what I just shared with you, because of our empathic wiring, you can't help but feel that. This is why it's hard to talk about. So we're all feeling this together now, to whatever degree it impacts you. And that's empathy. So, once we ground, we want to acknowledge the shock of what was just shared. That's shocking to hear. This is why these conversations about pornography and child pornography and human trafficking and pedophilia, this is why these are all really hard to have, because it puts us in shock and then it feels like we can't deal with this. So, Jeannie, the first thing that I want to say to you is you didn't do anything wrong, and there's nothing wrong with you. And primarily, there's nothing wrong with you. And I would invite you to take that awareness into your inner 17-year-old and let her know. 17, I mean, you're still just a fucking child, right? Like, I know the decisions I was making when I was 17, they weren't genius decisions. uh, so you want to let her know there's nothing wrong with her and she didn't do anything wrong. You're making the best decisions that you believed you were capable of at the time, the best decisions that you were capable of at the time. That conditioning, that physical, here's a big word, but it's relevant, psychoneuroimmunological conditioning. That is the conditioning of the nervous system, the hormones, and your emotions all working together to hold that state, that shame state in place. We want to just offer that the state of grace, compassion, and understanding. And I want to follow your comments. Oh gosh, you guys. And your husband was 15 years older. Yeah. So he was like the adult and he was abusing his position. He was being abusive of his maturity. He was being abusive of the fact that he could hold this over you. And there's something else that I think is important that we address here, and specifically for women, for you, Jeannie, to understand, and for any other women who have gone through this, listening to this. It's true for men as well, but it's more biologically conditioned in women. When we are threatened, as women, we tend to freeze, because more often than not, the aggressor that is threatening us is a man who is bigger than us. The same can be if it's a parent who is being abusive. What we will do is we'll freeze because we recognize we can't get away, and we can't fight back because biologically, more than likely, the person who we are perceiving as the threat, as the aggressor, is going to be bigger than us. So, Jeannie, this man's 15 years older than you. I imagine physically he probably outmassed you by quite a bit. Your best survival in that instance was probably to do exactly what you did for as long as you did it, to keep yourself and your children safe. So the freeze comes, and then what comes with the freeze is a psychological response that is known as fawning. This is what we tend to do when we are in a situation with an aggressor and we don't perceive that we can get out, fight back, is we take into account the what we actually have as a resource, which is our psychology. We figure out ways to be pleasing to them. Fawning means people pleasing. Anybody on this relate to people pleasing? Yeah, I'm sure. So what we do is we figure out how to be pleasing to them, how to ingratiate ourselves to them in order to keep ourselves safe. This will often cause us to draw a perpetrator closer to us. And you can kind of understand why we would do that, because if we can see them and track them and we know what they're doing, then that offers us a modicum of safety if they're out, rather than they're out there and we don't know what the hell's going on. But because, according to Brene Brown, who is a shame researcher, our bodies tend to interpret trauma and threat in the same way as we interpret shame. So Jeannie, you're underneath, like, I don't know, you guys are very chatty here, and I'm going to come and I'm going to get into all of these comments. Jeannie says it gives us some control. Yes, it does. It gives us back some sense of control, and that is important for us to feel safe. What it doesn't do when we freeze is it doesn't give us the opportunity to actually work that energy out of our system. So we perceive the threat, we experience it, we have our hormones fire off, preparing us to either run or to fight. And then if we don't physically exercise that option, which there's nothing wrong with us not if we don't feel like we can, those hormones still get stuck. And that energy gets stuck in our nervous system. It gets physically stuck inside of us because we're not able to discharge it. So from a physiological standpoint, it is better for us to run or fight. But from a psychological standpoint, if we recognize that that's not going to be a successful strategy, freeze is 100% viable. But freeze is also where a lot of us get locked in shame later. Okay. I want to come back up because I don't want to miss anybody's comments. Okay. Julie says, Jeannie, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I was beaten and raped repeatedly by a step-sibling as a child. And none of the adults in my life could help me or truly face what was needed. Instead, I was further abused and neglected by those I needed to pay attention and help me. The shame followed everyone, I think. Making the boy move out didn't wrap it up with a neat bow. No, it would not. And I want to come back down in my body and like feel this. Okay. First, Julie, I am so sorry that you went through that. So sorry. I want to address the fact that you put in your comment that the shame followed everyone. Yes. So I imagine, for you as the victim of this abuse, because of the trauma, there's shame. For the perpetrators, there's also shame. And this is why this cycle tends to perpetuate itself, because we can't talk about it. This kind of abuse, incest and physical abuse that happens within families is almost always transgenerational, which means that it jumps from generation to generation. It may skip a generation, but if you look through the family history, there's almost always a pattern. And part of the reason that the pattern repeats is because we don't have the capacity, the ability to talk about it. One of the things that comes inherently with shame is blame. We're looking for a place to discharge that discomfort. This gets tricky if you're talking about this kind of abuse moving through a family system, because they did do something wrong. Where we want to make a distinction between shame levying and weaponizing shame, and recognizing the difference between that and utilizing guilt as a means for creating empathy, experiencing guilt, and actually making a course correction with the behaviors. When people are in a state of shame, they're basically, because we're in fight or flight mode, we're in our limbic system, which means that our frontal cortex, our prefrontal cortex, is not capable of processing new information. And the system as well, the middle of the brain, we're not really capable of being in a state of empathy either. So instead of a person being able to make a course correction from shame, we need to separate that experience and that feeling away from our identity, which is why when we go to address it, the very first thing that we want to say to ourselves or to another is, there's nothing wrong with you. Now, if we want to talk about holding somebody accountable, creating accountability within an abusive system, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not an evil person, but what you did was evil. What you did was wrong. This was destructive, and there are consequences to being destructive with each other that need to be addressed. This is how we can actually start to break it down. We have to be grounded enough to be able to talk about the actual experience and to feel the pain and the fear and the sadness and the anger and the shock, all of that. But then we have to be skillful enough to begin to make that discernment between an individual and their behavior. And that's where things get tricky. Okay. Neglect is another one that you put in here, Julie, because it actually delays developmental processes as well. Shame, neglect, our brain reads neglect the same as it reads shame, or the same as it reads abuse. Thank you for sharing this, Julie. It's very brave for you to discuss this. I really appreciate it. And you as well, Jeannie. I really appreciate both of you being so brave and vulnerable in this thread, truly. Julie says, withdrawing was the safest for me, and an empath, I absorbed the shame no one else wanted to own on top of my own. Yes, I totally see that. And I will bring something up here that in no way is meant to disregard your experience, Julie, or anybody else's of being an empath. But most of us, myself included, who have in the past identified as an empath or who have had the experience of that sort of empathic overload and the enmeshment and not always being able to discern our own feelings and energies from others, is almost always the result of either physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual abuse, invasive energies, particularly at a young age, often with siblings or parents, and that sort of heightened sense of awareness of others and what they're going to do and how we're going to respond and how do we best prepare for that is actually neurological dysregulation. We can heal that, and we can still be deeply empathetic and not need to carry that level of enmeshment and that sort of lack of self-differentiation with others. Nicolette says, yes, and some safety keeping the enemy close. I believe you're talking about fawning. And that is absolutely true. If we can see what they're doing, then that gives us some kind of modicum of safety. Julie says, yes, it was passed on from the step family. I tried for years to communicate with those that I love that I needed. Oh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I have deep empathy for your experience, and I hope that you're finding some safety and stability at this current time in your life, and I really appreciate you sharing all of this. And Julie and Jeannie are just taking care of each other in this thread. They're just going back and forth. Thank you. Your support means the world to me. This is it, guys. This is it right here. Empathy. Your support, it means the world to me. I know you're on your healing journey. This is how we human, y'all. This is it. And Julie, I love you. And you guys, you're just tearing me up here. Jeannie says also, I lost my virginity when I was 13 to a priest who was a family friend, but I had trauma before that. Wow, okay, yes. Once again, so much love to you and your dear, sweet, brave heart for being so incredibly vulnerable in this thread. And I hope it's okay that I'm reading all of this out loud. It's gonna be here. Okay, pause, breathe, ground. We're kind of touching into all of these really tough taboo topics. Another one that spiritual abuse. Boy, okay. Grounding, feeling. All right, I'm going to tell you what I feel when I read that. I feel tremendous sadness instantly. Bring myself out of shock and back into my body. I can feel my limbic system firing off. Like, I can see my inner warrioress pulling her sword and wanting to take someone's fucking head. Wanting to take lots of heads, particularly people who put themselves in a position of spiritual authority who then abuse and misuse that position to that degree. I recognize that it's hurt people who tend to hurt people, but not all hurt people. So that is a false, that's a false equivalency that needs to be fucking burned down. There is no excuse for that. And systemically, particularly, I don't know if this was a Catholic priest, but it is certainly rampant within way too many religious systems that these people who are put into these positions of authority abuse and misuse that authority. So I want to draw this line for you, Jeannie. I don't know what abuse you experienced prior to this, but this man, this priest who was in your reality placed in a position of authority, who abused you at multiple levels. He physically violated your space by taking your virginity, emotionally violated you with that same act, and psychically and spiritually violated you by using his position of authority to abuse you, to manipulate you, and to take that innocence from you. And I think it is that spiritual abuse that is actually the grossest and the most insidious and the hardest to track, because it disrupts our bond with Creator. And when we're in a state of shame, it's really hard to feel that connection. That bond with Creator is also, it's intuitive and it's instinctive. So by having this person disrupt that bond with you at such a young age and the position that they were in to do it, I would say that this would result in deep intuitive and instinctive injury that would set you up perfectly to wind up becoming prey for your husband later. Because what you're talking about with him was certainly predatory behavior. And this is something that I talk about a lot, is our instinct injury and our relationship with our inner hunter. That when we have that online, when we haven't been knocked out of ourselves by abuse and shame, please understand your body interprets it the same way. We're much better at protecting ourselves. We're much better at sensing out fuckery. Jeannie says being an empath is exhausting sometimes. Yes, because your nervous system is on constant alert. Julie says, makes sense. I've learned to differentiate in the last few years. Angela says, thank you for this live. Nicolette says, this is powerful. Yes, thank you guys for being here, for participating, for witnessing this. This is how we heal this shit. Jeannie says, I believe my earliest trauma was related to not being enough, not keeping my single mother happy as a baby. I feel like that was my responsibility, and it shamed me that I let her down. Yes, love. Absolutely. And this is This is something that Gabor Mate talks about with great skillfulness and compassion, about how when we are raised by mothers in particular that are not emotionally present, that we internalize that. And that sets us up for lots of different twists and turns and adaptations later in life. And yes, it makes absolute sense, love. It makes perfect sense. We perceive the lack of care as being equal to a deficiency within ourselves. So your kind of unconscious internalization of this not being enough was you giving context to the fact that you weren't getting enough. And what we tend to do when we're that young, particularly pre-verbal, we create this unconscious context because we can't actually create a story that makes sense to us. We don't have the language for it. But because we don't have psychological filters between ourselves and our caregivers, whatever experience is going through them, we internalize and interpret it to be about us. Julie says, thank you for this. Agreed, not all hurt people hurt people. A man I thought was my friend, lover, my person, spiritually, emotionally, and psychically abused and gaslit me, and that pushed me further into the shame 4 years ago. I honestly can't handle it anymore. I'm even more isolated than I ever was. I feel some days I need to go on disability. I'm exhausted from fighting for myself. Oh, sweetie. I hear you. I feel that. Oh, and I feel that with you. And just pause and validate that. And I want to bring that comment back around to the fact that you said you're exhausted from fighting yourself. So this fight that you're fighting right now is going on internally. It's not getting discharged through your system. So your system is still in this constant fight, flight, freeze state. But instead of these feelings that this need to fight for yourself, it hasn't been able to find a state of resolution. And this brings us to a really important part about like the way that we tend to regulate as men versus as women. Because as women, we tend to freeze more often when we're either in threat or shame. And men tend to, not always, I don't want to say unilaterally across the board, but more often than not, they tend to fight it out, or at least move away. But for those of us who freeze, who internalize that struggle, we need a different means for neurologically re-regulating ourselves. And so the typical advice to sort of be still and meditate to calm your nervous system is actually kind of antithetical to what we really need. We need to move, and we need to rage, and we need to cry, and we need to dance, and we need to shake. We need to physically fucking discharge and not sit on our goddamn yoga mats like we're fucking falling asleep. And that's not true for all of us, but it's coming to the surface that more often for women, because we do tend to freeze, what we need to actually bring our systems back into a state of regulation is we need to move and we need to discharge. So all this talk collectively about this kind of like this angry goddess energy, this is us coming out of freeze. So for anybody who sort of resonates with that Kali vibe, who wants to take some fucking heads, like, hey, I am I'm your priestess. I'm also the princess of freeze. Kickboxing, baby. Fuck yeah. And I've had to learn the difference between like when activating a trauma is going to, or when moving through a trauma needs to be done like by being relaxed and chill and still and like sitting in my fucking chair for days on end, or when I need to get my ass up and go dance up the hill or go swim it out or go for a drive and literally go into the mountains and fucking howl, because that's a thing. Oh yeah, that's a thing. That's a thing I do. It's so good. But this angry goddess, you know, and this is a distinction that we want to make so that we don't do further damage in ourselves, with our own kind of inner masculine and with the men in our lives. Like, a lot of this energy that we're coming unfrozen from, that we've been subjected to, has this kind of patriarchal, subjective, abusive, enslaved kind of energy to it, and enslavement, right? Fawning, freezing and fawning, right? We want to address the behaviors specifically to the best of our ability, and those are not defined to men or women. These are behaviors that men and women both embody. But we want to address the behaviors as specifically as possible, rather than just discharging on our men. It will actually shorten our healing time as women, and it will actually kind of help us as men and women heal together. So be specific. If somebody specifically in your life has abused you, fucking unleash that shit on them, even if you do it in your internal world. If, you know, whether that's a man or a woman, that there is an absolute psychic, spiritual, and emotional appropriateness to having violent visions. It's okay to meet violence with violence. Sometimes we need it. Julie says, did I read this? I don't think so. Oh yes, no, I read that one. Okay. Nicolette says, I can relate to this. I was in a toxic relationship for 5 years. I've just now started to feel like myself 2 years later. Yeah, I hear that. And I just want to like create space and acknowledge you. And I relate to that. I relate to that myself. I was in a toxic relationship as well. I did not recognize it as how toxic it was until I was really on the other side. And it's taken me several years to kind of collect the pieces of myself and integrate and come to a different place emotionally, neurologically, relationally. It's hard fucking work. Yeah. Nicolette says, isolation was necessary for me. Good for us. I stopped drinking too, but I smoke like a chimney. Hey, you know what? We drop our, you know, our soothing mechanisms, our addictions, our habits, to the ability that we feel soothed and comforted, and that we are getting our needs met in other places. So I've learned I have to let my cat in because he will destroy my door. I'm coming, asshole. I'm coming. All right, in you go. I have learned, and a lot from listening to Gabor Mate, who talks about addictions as soothing mechanisms rather than problems that need to be solved, that the more effectively and the more deeply our needs are being met, the less inclined we are to what tend to be a little bit more self-destructive behaviors in regards to meeting those needs. So smoke away, babe, until you don't need it. David, you're the one who said kickboxing. Fuck yeah. I I don't do kickboxing. I really like dancing though. Nicolette says, "Oh my God, I just had an epiphany about how I'm getting it out. No more walking to music. I'm going to the forest to dance." Yeah, forest dancing. There's a reason that like witches have been into this shit for years. Like we know what's up. Like we innately know how to regulate ourselves when we are not so deeply instinct injured that we have shut that wisdom down. We also have the ability to sense out predation. Like we're wild fucking animals underneath all this socialization, underneath, our fancy costumes and sexy lingerie and hiking gear or whatever else you're into wearing or not wearing, whatever. Like there's a wild, primal, living, breathing, sniffing creature within you that knows what you need, that knows how you feel, that knows what is and what is not good for you, that knows what you should and should not eat, that recognizes poison and that recognizes predators. We have to wake up our feelings and wake up our bodies to be able to access that. Jeannie says, "My trauma needs art sometimes and nature sometimes, but it needs my attention frequently nowadays." I hear that, babe. Absolutely. And giving ourselves the correct kind of attention is one of those places of discernment. A lot of the things that we tend to do are distracting us from that discomfort, are distracting us from that pain, and are kind of helping us kind of maybe encapsulate it until we're ready to deal with it. But as we get ready to deal with it, then we learn to be more gentle with ourselves, and we learn to we find teachers and helpers and healers to support us in that journey. Tim says, "I find it helps to shift anger to indignation, as I find anger just simmers and festers, where indignation I'm more inclined to act upon." Yeah, I love that, because I read somewhere a quote recently about how anger is more of kind of a personal emotion and how indignation is sort of more directed at a larger issue. So I really resonate with that, which is one of the reasons why if you go back through my feed, you'll see, I've been into calling out, talking about predation and Wetiko, and specifically going after some predatory coaches in the last month, because I see these behaviors as problems that need to be addressed, and they make me angry. Jeannie says, "I have to tell you, I found forgiveness for that priest, and I have contacted him, and we have had some very productive conversations." That's powerful, love. And I am glad that you are able to move into that place of catharsis with yourself and include him in that process. And for anybody else who isn't able and won't and can't, I validate your experience and decision as well. Julie says, "For me, art, quiet, nature, singing very loud, allowing myself to start crying again. I smoke a lot too. My body hurts and I move it when I can. Kickboxing was amazing and I want to do it again." Yeah, girl, get it. I might have to start it too. Shit. Paige says, "For me, learning to sit still is my work. When I was young, I didn't have much of a voice. I wanted to make life easier for those around me. When I got into my 20s, as I was, when I got into, this woman is, I love you. You're prolific and beautiful, and I miss working with you. When I got into my 20s, as I was first learning to find my footing, I became explosive. I had no issue exploding my rage and fighting anyone at any time. It was destructive. For me, I had to learn how to sit with myself lovingly and tenderly, and feel my internal world in real time. I acknowledged my inner collie that's chomping at the bit to take some heads, but she needed to learn some manners. I'm growing more skillful at knowing what I need in the moment and how much care means, safe space means. Thank you for your help with this." My pleasure, beauty. It is a joy and delight to watch you fucking bloom. I do miss dancing with others, though. Fuck yeah, dancing is the shit. Tim says, I did amazing work calling out those scumbags. I know, I'm so proud. I got like so hardcore blocked by so many people last month. Like, props for me. Hashtag notorious. It's fun. Good times. Ooh, Jeannie says maybe we could start a trauma kickboxing class. That sounds fun. Paige says yes, you did. Thank you for the validation. I appreciate it. One of the ways for me to wake up my freeze response is to address these behaviors that wake up this indignancy in me, and coming out of shame and coming into a greater sense of aliveness for myself is acknowledging that I have skills and I have information and I have power that needs to be accessed appropriately and needs to be expressed appropriately. And for me, part of what is in alignment for that is addressing predation and parasitism, which are kind of the sort of underlying kind of driving energies that keep trauma and shame active. So the better we are at recognizing it, and the better we are at confronting it in whatever way is appropriate for us and moving through it with compassion, the more we're kind of doing to sort of stop the perpetuation of it and to generate resilience. Not sure how long I've been talking to you guys. I don't want to keep you all day, but this has been such a good conversation. I want to acknowledge that you women who shared your stories in this thread, you're so brave and so tender and so powerful, and I really want to acknowledge that and thank you for your willingness to share. Paige says, it is so important. You inspired me so much with your courage. It was interesting to feel myself feeling scared for you. That was interesting for me to feel, and I came back to trusting. I already loved you before that, but damn, you are amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been in my nature for as long as I can remember, and learning to do it more skillfully, learning to use that anger more skillfully and with discernment has been a part of my journey into maturity. Recognizing when that freeze response is coming up, when that shame is coming up, what do I need to do to best tend to that? So there's been a lot of intensity in this conversation, and I kind of want to bring this back down to sort of a little bit more mundane place before we close it out, and acknowledge that whereas clearly these sexual encounters where abuse, where gaslighting and manipulation are all shame triggers, so are things like losing our temper with our kids. So are things like feeling like we can't pay our bills. This was my shame trigger today. Like I woke up and my power had been switched off because there had been some miscommunication around the bill, and like I instantly, as soon as I heard, I was like, freeze to the belly, shock. There goes that voice, like, you're the worst fucking adult ever, you suck, da 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 da. And it's like, okay, stop, pretend, breathe, check in with reality, like, feel the body, you're safe, you're okay, like, find the most skillful way to navigate through this. But it's a survival thing. Almost all of our shame triggers are. Another one that I want to bring up that I think is really important and relevant for people is like body shame. We have so much expectation and projection on the way that we look and the way that we show up in the world. We're kind of sort of constantly pinning this notion of perfectionism onto ourselves. Body shame is very real for a lot of people. It doesn't tend to grab me in that way. It did. It used to. I used to have serious, intense body dysmorphia, but it doesn't so much anymore. What are some other shame triggers? I mean, anywhere that we can kind of like look at ourselves as not being good enough, not, we can catch that voice, that sort of insidious voice. Perfectionism in and of itself is shame because it's a fantasy ideal. There is no way that we are ever going to be able to attain the ideal of perfectionism. Tim says being told you're so ugly at 11 years old, that never goes away. Yeah, that hits, right? How many of you guys can relate to that? Being told that you're ugly. I just want to bring this conversation out to the more mundane, to recognize that like there are so many things that we can experience in our daily lives that can be shame triggers. And if we can be a little bit more aware of what those are and physically how we respond to them, we can kind of help break this cycle up. Paige says, me being told I was stupid. Yeah, that's a big one. Being told you're stupid. It's like, it doesn't, okay, so the difference between shame and guilt is shame is an identified state that you are identifying your internal qualities with this judgment or someone else's opinion. So being told you're stupid, this isn't saying, hey, Paige, like your math skills leave something to be desired, or perhaps you could work on your reading comprehension. There isn't an identification with a behavior, with something that could potentially be addressed by gaining more skillful means or by making a course correction in behavior. It is about your personhood. Shame is about your personhood. Guilt is about behavior, or skillfulness. And guilt isn't really that effective of a learning tool unless, you're trying to correct someone's poor behavior. Perfectionism, a fantasy ideal stemming from shame. Yes. One of the gems I bring. Thank you. This is important to me. This is foundational to the work that I do. And quite selfishly, this is like core to my own healing. I'm a brutal perfectionist with myself. I've gotten way better. One of my massive shame triggers used to be like every time, say I would get done doing this live with you, my brain would be instantly flooded with all of the things that I didn't say that I should say. And I still do this sometimes, particularly with lovers. It's moved more into like this really intimate realm for me instead of being this sort of collective thing. It's like, so like for me, I'll take like pictures. Like I've taken a couple of selfies in the last weeks where I was like literally wearing nothing. Nothing was visible, right? But like I feel no sense of shame about that. And anybody who wants to tell me that like there's something wrong with my body, or anybody who wants to call me a narcissist, like it just fucking rolls off my back. I could give a fuck less. But like about a month ago, like I needed to ask I wanted to ask, this is so silly, but this is so true. I wanted to ask a former lover if I could bring a load of laundry over to his house to do it, because we had some other errands that we had to do, and I couldn't fucking bring myself to do it. That felt more vulnerable for me. That felt like more shame oriented. Like, oh my God, like I can't seem like this ineffective at adulting. And same thing with the post that I made today about communicating with Northwest Energy about my power being shut off. That was far more fucking vulnerable for me because that makes me feel like, God, I'm like, look at me. See, okay, see, this is how you can tell. All right, here's a shame trigger. All right, I'll show you guys. This is what it looks like for me. I turn pink. I do this when I'm aroused too, so it's a similar reaction, but it hits my chest. I feel tightening in my jaw. My mouth is watering. My throat is restricting. I'm kind of experiencing sort of like a distortion in my reality frame right now, because this is what brings shame up to me. Is like, okay, you're an adult. You should be able to pay your fucking bills. You had the money to do it. Like, this is like this stupid fucking narrative, right? And it has no bearing on my self-worth. And it has no bearing on my level of skillfulness to interact and impart and be of benefit to other people's lives, which is deeply important to me. And it was easily fucking handled. But fuck, it felt vulnerable to talk about it. Like, I listened to people like you and Julie and Nicole, Nicolette, all you guys who shared this deeply vulnerable stuff today. I listened to this kind of information from people all day, sometimes every day in my practice. I have written about and I have shared about my own trauma, my own history with addiction. I have shared about just about every sort of nitty-gritty thing within my soul. But when it came to typing up that post about dropping the ball with paying my power bill, and it wasn't even that, like, that's me actually kind of shaming myself right now. That's me kind of like trying to lock that neurological state in of like me not adulting well and me being a fuck up. Like, I was lacking information to make the judgment calls and to communicate in the way that I needed to communicate. And that's a big shame trigger for me too. That's a big one from my childhood, is people not being clear and people not saying what was on their mind or following through with what they said they were going to do, or just being the same kind of human being from moment to moment. So when I had that feeling come up, Lori, if you're still here, you said you felt like you were 12. I felt like I was 12. I was like, I'm a 12-year-old who needs to pay a power bill. Like, wait, no, that's not true. I have a bank account and I have a credit card and I have a car with a car charger where I can like go plug my dying phone in so I can handle this. It's like the moment it comes through, the moment you start to feel whatever your trigger is, mine's that flush and usually that like freeze, knock, like clench in my belly, right? I have to try to pause and recognize what's happening. And almost without fail, when that shame trigger comes up, we're also going to start regressing. And we're going to suddenly be less skillful. We're going to be less competent. We're going to be less articulate, less able to communicate. We're going to fall into whatever our go-to fight or flight thing is. So if you tend to attack, you're likely to lash out at someone. You tend to run away, you're gonna retreat, you're gonna avoid. You tend to freeze, you're probably gonna shut down. You tend to fawn, you want to watch yourself for people pleasing in those moments. Like knowing what we go to when we feel threatened is also knowing what we go to when we feel shamed. And learning how to learning how to best effectively meet ourselves in that moment when that is the most active is the best way to interrupt that cycle. And sometimes we just need to step away from a conversation. We need to wait to reply or respond to a text or a phone call. We need to sit down on the ground and breathe. We need to drink water. We need to do whatever we need to do. We need to walk around the block and discharge energy, but we need to do whatever we need to do to meet ourselves in that moment. And then we can move forward. We can keep sharing. And we do better if we want to share our shame. We actually do better after we've kind of grounded and regulated. Like, I would have not attempted to have this conversation with you guys today. It would have been completely inappropriate for me while I was still triggered. So what I did is I went and I got my coffee. I went out to the hot springs. I came home, and miracle of miracles, my power had been turned back on. I got reboosted. But I would not have wanted to really talk to anybody while I was in that state. And that is a perfectly reasonable response and reaction to shame. Because what we'll do is, if we don't have the ability to ground and kind of hold it, then more from a more stable, physically neurological standpoint, it tends to spread and it tends to sort of crawl into other people and kind of trigger their shame as well. Paige said typing that made you tear up. Yeah, babe, I hear you. I hear you. Even those weird, seemingly innocuous triggers can be so insidious. And I think some of the more simple ones, like, because you don't know to like fight it off. If someone's like being physically abusive, like, yeah, you recognize you should fight that off. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But if someone's just sort of saying this kind of mean, sort of degrading stuff to you, and it kind of matches with your internal dialogue already, that shit can be really fucking hard to fight off. And we will gaslight ourselves out of what we know and what we feel to be right and true because we've been trained to do that. Nicolette says, so much for communication classes in school. God, the world is backwards. I know, fucking right. Like, you're going to teach me about ancient history, but you're not going to teach me about how to communicate with other people. Thanks for nothing. Tim says, beautiful pictures. Thank you. I enjoy my selfies as well. Paige says, thank you for sharing that. Oh, about my post this morning. Yeah, it was really, I felt like the best way for me to move through it and to hopefully, create some relatability with other people was to talk about it. And now I wanted to talk even more about it. And look at all of you beautiful, brave people just sharing all these deep, dark, really gorgeous, sacred corners of your heart. I think that's what shame does, and Brene says it thrives in isolation and it shrinks when we share it. So everybody who's participated in this conversation today, thank you for being active advocates and participants in shrinking shame. Paige says, I do all of them depending upon the activation. Yeah, me too. It's good to know your go-to. Lori says, still here. Yes, I had a lot of adult responsibilities then. When you were 12, yes. And you were probably, even if you were, it was inappropriate. It's inappropriate to expect a 12-year-old to act like an adult. Caitlin says, it is interesting to me to equate reactions of shame with reactions to fight or flight. I'm going to have to think about that. It makes sense that the triggers are similar. Yeah, absolutely. Because we perceive it as a threat to our personhood. And it is. It's psychologically and emotionally and physically destabilizing. Oh, and Peo. Good. I'm glad you brought this one up. Paige says, especially when those statements are laced with humor, the cognitive dissonance. Ooh. Okay. Yes. And it's not gaslighting. I think the cognitive dissonance is a good one because we're experiencing a neurological disconnect. We're experiencing the energy and the statement as being a violation and being abusive, and yet the delivery is attempted to be clothed in humor, which is super confusing and fucking distorting to our relationship, because it's like the person is saying one thing and the other is you're feeling something else. And that's where that's another one of those ways that we get instinct injured, because our instincts are like, wait, this is wrong, but you're joking about it. It was the same way with me and my household, that bullying was clothed in teasing humor, and it wasn't. It was dehumanizing. It was mean. Jeannie says, I love the way you approach these issues head on. You don't have another setting, do you? No, not really. I can be tactful. This is why I warn people when this is why I interview people. I don't warn them. I might warn them. This is why I interview people to see if we're a good match to work with each other, is because no, I'm not interested in dancing around the issue. I'm interested in getting to the root of our humanity and sharing that with each other. And I'll do it gently and respectfully, but I like to be direct, and I appreciate directness. Blah 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 blah. Where do we go here? Caitlin says, so then if that is true, then shame triggers the narcissist to abuse. Now that one hits me right in the chest. Yes, absolutely. This is a huge, massive topic, and we'll get back into this, but I think it's worth acknowledging because the people who experienced the abuse that you spoke about earlier, we're not going to psychologically diagnose the people who abused you as being narcissists. But I will say that without a shadow of a doubt, they were underneath the influence of what I have been talking about and referring to as Wetiko. And this is a psychospiritual parasite that everybody carries, but those who don't tend to their wounds, their trauma, their pain, and who will do everything in their power to divert guilt tend to become more heavily infected and tend to act it out far more toxically and abusively. So usually there is a wound in which it gets activated. And what happens with a narcissist is that they identify as their persona more than their feelings. So shame is an attack on personhood. It's not related to guilt or actions or empathy, which they typically are rather cut off from. It is about their personhood. And with a narcissist, their entire identity is built around their personhood. So when they experience shame, it is deeply destabilizing and quite frequently dangerous. Tim says, gallows humor doesn't always translate well, and less so when typed. Yes. My necklace is carved slate. No, my necklace is black kyanite. Black kyanite with a little citrine crown. Sexy, ain't it? I picked it up and couldn't put it down. Nicolette says, I'm here because she's blunt. Intelligence and spirit are just pluses. Thank you. But I will tell you, even in my bluntness, my surgical tool is sharp as fuck, because I don't want to create any more damage than what has already been done. I just want to cut out the fucking infection. Okay, then, and Caitlin says, okay, then I refrain. Wetiko feeds on shame. Yes. Wetiko. Wetiko feeds on shame. God, we'll have a whole nother conversation about Wetiko because it's important that everybody know about. Wetiko, this psychospiritual parasite, thrives in isolation. Shame thrives in isolation. Julie says, I love your bluntness too. You are a mentor. Yes, I am. Professionally, that's what I do. I also don't want to create any more damage either. I need to refine my blade. Yes, it helps. Refining the blade, becoming more skillful in the way that we address these is my goal. I think, you know, with our sort of shared hope to be better humans with each other, it's a valuable goal. And it's not a it's not about stifling ourselves. It's not about and it's not about filtering. It's about a process of refinement and discernment. And um it's also about judgment, you know. Spiritually, we're not supposed to be judgmental. I'm judgmental as a mother lover, like seriously. And I'm down with the snap judgments too, because I trust that they come instinctively and intuitively to me, and I don't have a problem with it. Prejudging people because of the way that they look or the way that they their opinions, I'm not into that. But trusting those deeper instincts to make accurate judgments and assessments about people and situations is something that I have been honing and repairing for years. So yes, I am 100% okay with being judgmental. Julie says, I meant that you have been a mentor for me for years personally. Yes. Yes. And humbly and delighted so. Anybody I have the pleasure and honor to work with, I'm humbled and I am honored by our interactions. I look at us as equals on our healing journeys. I am full-time fucking devoted to developing skills to address this stuff, for my own personal well-being, but also to be of benefit. Paige says, learning to wield anger with maturity is something you are modeling for me beautifully, and for that I am most grateful. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, because I grew up around people who were volatile and could not control their tempers, and I have a temper, and it used to come out sideways, and it used to come out passive aggressively. So hearing that it is perceived by others that my relationship with anger is maturing beautifully is validating to me and my inner work and what I personally fucking feel about myself. People, I've said some pretty volatile things on occasion, and I talk about taking people's heads without remorse. People will tell me, you have a problem with your anger. I'll be like, no, I have a profound and sacred relationship with my anger. There's a difference. It was a problem when I was pretending it wasn't there. Paige says, when I first got into Buddhism and was preaching about non-judgment, my mom spoke a hard stop to make sure I knew my gut judgments are my greatest guide. Fuck yeah. Good job, Mom. And it's something that is built into Buddha Dharma, honestly. It's called fierce compassion versus idiot compassion. And it holds that there is an appropriate place and there is right action, there is right alignment for both judgment and anger. Idiot compassion is trying to get to that state of forgiveness or to that state of equality before the work is done. And we don't need to make ourselves equal to abusers. Like, in the eyes of spirit, we already are. What we need to do is we need to work through our genuine fucking feelings about our experiences and let them come to God or not, as is right for us in our journey. Coming back to you people who expressed abuse, like, I'll share this briefly because it ties in my example of some of us have the need to discharge and express anger as a path to healing. And that can be through internal work. It doesn't have to necessarily be through, going out and chopping off the head of your abuser. You don't want to wind up in jail yourself, right? But I've had clients, and I had one client specifically and who's grotesquely violated as a child. And we were working together, and I was having her go in to retrieve her inner little, and I saw it kind of intuitively, psychically before she saw it. I saw a bloodbath, and she told me what she wanted to do. She was like, I'm holding a knife, and I'm gonna slaughter him. I'm gonna cut him to shreds. She was like, is that okay? I was like, yes, absolutely, that is okay. Absolutely, that is okay. It is okay to express, to excise that divine violence, particularly in your psychic, when clearing out your internal space. And you know, it was, she took out everybody in her way, and she went and she picked up that little innocent and brought it back out with her. And like, it was deeply cathartic process for her. I don't know. And you know, to come back to this idea that a lot of us freeze, a lot of us hold that shame state because we freeze. This can be an effective way to break free from that. Caitlin says, all the Buddhist dogma about letting go of anger or dismissing anger was not something the Buddha preached. It was distortion by his followers. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, and you know, it's like, you look at Jesus and like him flipping tables and releasing his righteous anger on the money changers in the temple. It's like, our anger is there to keep us safe, you know, and it is 100% valid expression of our humanity. It's not something that we want to neurologically fall into where we keep recreating it. We want to let it run its course. We want to discharge it. We want to acknowledge that that it can be a part of the shame cycle, but the healthy acknowledgement and discharge of it can also be a part of breaking that cycle up. As can sadness, as can grief. There's something really powerful about anger. And I almost wonder if, like, you know, as far as like the field's work to sort of keep the state of enslavement in place, if there isn't some kind of intentional misinformation that isn't being placed out there about anger being low vibration or how it's not spiritual, because it is. It absolutely is. It just needs to be exercised appropriately. It needs to be acknowledged as a tool. It needs to be honed and treated with respect. I'll have to do another live on anger. All right, guys. This was an intense and rambling and beautiful conversation, and I deeply appreciate everybody's participation and willingness to dive in. If you don't know me, I'm Justice Bartlett. My website is illuminationwithjustice.com. If we're not Facebook friends, you can friend me. If you would like a more private space for talking about this kind of stuff, I run a Facebook group called Meeting the Hard, Holy, and Human with Compassion. I'll come back and drop a link for that, and you can request to be added. I think you have to request to be my friend first, because, you know, who wouldn't want to be my friend? And if you feel inspired to share this, that would be fantastic. I think there's some really useful information and some really beautiful states and some incredible vulnerability in this video. And for everybody who shared, thank you so much for your bravery. And Nicolette says, live on anger, pretty please. Yeah, babe, you got it. I'll do that. And any other topics that you guys want to request that I do lives on, I'm going to get into doing these again more. Please feel free to drop requests in this live broadcast. I always try to come back and make sure I attended to all the comments, or DM me if you have any questions about what it might be like to work with me. You can DM me about that too. I interview all of my clients to make sure we're a good match to dive into the field, into our humanity together. So there we go. I promoted myself. I answered. I responded. Felt. Let's breathe. Hmm. Paige says work with her. Thank you, beauty. I love working with you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Mm. Let's breathe. And just ground, connect, wiggle your toes, feel your belly, drop your shoulders. Let that love light shine. And take care of yourselves and each other. Have a great day.